The father's justice. The moment Lily Brooks called me a hateful man, the room seemed to freeze in place, like time itself had been caught off guard by the sheer weight of her words. It was Thanksgiving, the kind of evening that's supposed to feel warm, predictable, safe. But nothing about that moment felt safe anymore. I was standing at the head of the table I had built with my own hands years ago, surrounded by people who were supposed to be family, and yet I had never felt more like a stranger in my own home. The candles flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the walls, but no one moved, no one spoke. Lily leaned back in her chair, wine glass in hand, her expression sharp, almost amused, as if what she had just said was something long overdue. Across from me, guests sat frozen, unsure where to look, caught in a moment they never expected to witness. I set my glass down slowly, deliberately, the soft sound against the table echoing louder than it should have in that suffocating silence. Then I looked straight at her, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with a clarity that had been building for years. "How does it feel?" I said quietly, my voice steady enough to cut through the tension. "To know you're homeless, starting today?" The shift was immediate. Her smile vanished, just for a second, replaced by something else, something uncertain. No one breathed. You could feel it, that invisible crack running through the room, splitting everything that had once held this family together. And then there was Ethan, my son, sitting just a few feet away, his eyes fixed somewhere between the table and the floor, his silence louder than anything Lily had said. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. And in that moment, I understood something I had been refusing to see for a long time. This wasn't just about disrespect. This wasn't just about one cruel sentence spoken over dinner. This was the end of something much deeper, something that had been breaking, quietly and patiently, long before anyone else noticed. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 58 years old, and for most of my life, I built things that were meant to last. Bridges, foundations, structures that had to hold under pressure without warning. Because in my line of work, failure isn't dramatic. It's silent and it's final. I spent over 3 decades as a construction engineer, learning to trust logic over emotion, discipline over impulse, and observation over assumption. You don't survive 30 years on job sites by reacting. You survive by paying attention to the details that other people miss. Hairline cracks, slight shifts in weight, small inconsistencies that don't seem like much at first, but always mean something deeper is coming. That mindset didn't stay at work. It followed me home. It shaped how I lived, how I raised my son, and how I dealt with loss. And loss came earlier than I ever expected. My wife passed away years ago, and when she did, the house we built together didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't just quieter, it was different. Emptier in a way that no amount of routine could fix. But I kept going, because that's what you do when there's still someone depending on you. Ethan was all I had left, and I made sure he never felt like he had to carry the weight of that loss alone. I raised him with the same principles I lived by: stability, responsibility, respect. And for a long time I believed those lessons had taken root. But life doesn't follow blueprints. It shifts, it breaks, and sometimes it tests everything you thought was solid. A few years ago, Ethan lost his wife in an accident. It hit him harder than I had ever seen. The grief, the medical bills, the silence that followed, it reminded me too much of what I had already lived through. And when he met Lily, when I saw even a small piece of him come back to life, I made a decision I believed was right. I didn't hesitate. I stepped in, not because I was asked, but because that's what a father does when his son is standing at the edge of collapse. I believed I was helping him rebuild, giving him a foundation strong enough to start again. What I didn't realize was that not every structure you build is meant to protect you. Some are built in a way that slowly pushes you out. The decision didn't feel complicated at the time. It felt right. After everything Ethan had been through, after the weight he was carrying, I wanted to give him something solid again, something that wouldn't shift under his feet the way life just had. So I transferred the deed of the house to Ethan and Lily. Legally. Completely documented. No shortcuts. But I wasn't careless. Not after a lifetime of understanding how structures fail when you ignore the small details. I kept one clause in place. Lifetime residency rights. It was simple, precise, and clear. I could live in that house for the rest of my life, unless there was documented abuse or serious misconduct from the people living with me. At the time, it felt like a formality, a line of protection I never thought I would actually need. That house wasn't just property to me. I designed it myself years earlier, back when my wife was still alive. Every wall, every beam, every angle had been planned with intention. It wasn't just about strength, it was about balance, flow, and the quiet sense of permanence you feel when something is built the right way. I knew exactly how the foundation sat beneath the soil, how the load was distributed across the frame, how the electrical and plumbing systems were mapped to support a full household without strain. It was more than a structure. It was a record of everything I had learned in over 3 decades of building things that were meant to endure. Inside that house were years of life, memories layered into every corner. The kitchen where Ethan used to sit as a kid, asking me questions while I worked late nights. The living room where my wife and I spent quiet evenings, not saying much, but not needing to. The walls held more than paint, they held time. And when I signed those papers, handing that house over, I believed I was passing on more than ownership. I believed I was giving my son stability, a foundation strong enough to carry him forward. What I didn't see, or maybe what I chose not to see, was that I had also created a structure where the balance could shift, where control could change hands, and where the one detail I treated as a precaution, that legal clause, would eventually become the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had built. At first, nothing felt serious enough to question, just small changes, the kind people make when they're trying to turn a house into something that feels like their own. Lily started with the living room, replacing furniture piece by piece, moving things around without really asking, but always explaining it in a way that sounded reasonable. She said the space needed to feel more modern, more open, more aligned with how people live now. I didn't argue. After all, I had given them the house. It made sense that they would want to shape it. But there was something in the way those changes happened. Quiet, gradual, almost deliberate. Like parts of the house were being rewritten without acknowledgement of what had been there before. Then came the comments. Subtle at first, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Little remarks about how I did things, how I dressed, how I moved through the space. You don't have to keep everything the same. Daniel, you might want to update some of your habits, always said with a tone that sounded helpful on the surface, but carried something sharper underneath. I've spent too many years around people to miss that difference. In construction, you learn quickly that problems don't start with collapse. They start with pressure, building in places no one checks. And those comments, they felt like pressure. What made it harder to ignore wasn't what Lily said. It was what Ethan didn't say. At first, he would laugh it off, change the subject, step out of the room like it wasn't worth getting into. Small exits, quick distractions, ways to keep things calm without actually addressing anything. I told myself he was just trying to keep the peace, that he didn't want conflict in a house that was supposed to be a fresh start. But over time, those moments started to add up. Conversations would shift the second tension appeared. My presence would become something that needed to be worked around instead of included. It wasn't one moment. It was a pattern, a quiet, steady shift in how I was treated inside a place I once understood completely. The house hadn't changed structurally, but something inside it had. And the longer I watched, the more I realized this wasn't about furniture or casual remarks. It was the beginning of something else. Something slow, controlled, and far more intentional than it first appeared. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it harder to confront. It was a slow erasure, piece by piece, detail by detail, until one day I looked around and realized I no longer recognized the place I was living in. The furniture I had chosen years ago, solid, practical, built to last, was gone, replaced with fragile pieces that looked like they belonged in a showroom instead of a home. My recliner, the one I used to sit in after long days on job sites, disappeared without a word. When I asked about it, Lily said she had sold it because it didn't match the new aesthetic. Then the photos started disappearing. At first, I thought I had misplaced them, maybe boxed them away without remembering. But no, they had been removed, carefully, intentionally. The frames that once held memories of my wife, of Ethan growing up, of the life we built together, replaced with abstract prints and empty space. When I asked Lily, she smiled politely and said she was decluttering, that the house needed to feel fresh, less heavy. Heavy. That's what she called a lifetime of memories. But nothing prepared me for the day I found the wedding album. It was in the trash, not tossed carelessly, but buried under coffee grounds and food scraps, like something that needed to be hidden, not just discarded. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to understand how something that had once meant everything could be reduced to garbage in my own home. Those photos weren't just images, they were proof that my life had mattered, that the years I spent building something with my wife had been real, and now they were being treated like clutter. When I confronted Lily, she didn't deny it. She didn't apologize either. She shrugged, said she didn't realize it was important, that I was holding on to the past too much, that it was time to move forward. The calmness in her voice was what struck me the most. There was no hesitation, no recognition of what she had done. To her, this wasn't cruelty. It was improvement. And slowly the house began to feel smaller, not physically, but in the way space was controlled. I noticed where I could sit, where I shouldn't leave things, how my presence was starting to feel like an inconvenience rather than something natural. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Plans would be made without me. Even the kitchen, once the center of everything, became a place where I felt like I needed permission to exist. It wasn't just about objects anymore. It was about ownership, about control, about rewriting the meaning of the space until there was no trace left of the person who built it. And standing there, holding that ruined album in my hands, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, a quiet, methodical process of making me invisible inside the very house I had given them. What made everything harder to accept wasn't just what Lily was doing, it was what Ethan wasn't. I kept waiting for him to say something, anything that would remind me the man sitting across from me was still the son I had raised. But every time a moment came, every time her words crossed a line, he chose silence. Not loud, defiant silence, but quiet avoidance. He would look down at his plate, shift in his seat, and find something else to focus on, as if ignoring it could somehow make it disappear. At first, I told myself he was trying to keep the peace, that he didn't want to turn small tensions into something bigger, that maybe he thought I could handle it, that I didn't need him to step in. But over time, that explanation stopped making sense, because this wasn't about one moment. It was a pattern, a consistent choice to step back when stepping forward was the only thing that mattered. There were times I tried to give him an opening. I would look at him after something Lily said, not asking directly, just waiting, giving him the chance to meet my eyes and acknowledge what was happening. But he never did. He stayed somewhere in between, not agreeing with her, but not standing with me either. And that space, that distance, grew wider every day. I started to realize that silence isn't neutral. It isn't harmless. When someone chooses not to act while something wrong is happening right in front of them, they're still making a decision. And Ethan made that decision over and over again, not with words, but with absence. That's when it shifted for me, not suddenly, but quietly, the same way everything else had been changing. I stopped seeing him as someone who was caught in the middle and started seeing him as someone who had already chosen a side, not because he said it out loud, but because he didn't need to. His silence said enough. And that realization was heavier than anything Lily had done. Because losing respect from someone who was never yours to begin with is one thing. But watching your own son disappear piece by piece, Until there's nothing left of the person you thought you knew, that's a different kind of loss. A quieter one, but deeper. The shift didn't come from emotion. It came from pattern. After years of working in construction, I learned that when something feels off, you don't argue with it. You investigate it. And once I started paying attention beyond the surface, things stopped looking like tension and started looking like evidence. It began with the bills. I had been contributing my share every month, just like we agreed. Utilities, groceries, everything accounted for. But then the notices started showing up. Late payments, warnings. One envelope from the electric company marked "Final Notice" is sitting unopened on the counter. That doesn't happen by accident. Not repeatedly. When I asked Ethan about it, he looked uncomfortable. Said Lily was handling the finances, that maybe something got mixed up. But numbers don't get mixed up like that. Not consistently. So I started tracking it myself. Dates, amounts, payment gaps. And what I found wasn't confusion. It was redirection. Money that should have gone toward keeping the house running was being used somewhere else. Inventory purchases for her online store. Items that never seemed to move. Boxes that came in but rarely went out. The business she talked about with confidence wasn't generating what she claimed, and instead of adjusting, she was pulling from shared expenses to keep it afloat. That alone would have been enough to raise concern. But then I started noticing the physical changes to the house in a different way. Not as design choices, but as structural decisions. Cabinets replaced without permits. Part of the wall was removed between the kitchen and dining area. New lighting was installed where there hadn't been any before. To most people, it probably looked like renovation, improvement. But to me, it looked unfinished, unchecked, and potentially dangerous. I knew exactly how that house was built. I knew where the electrical lines ran, how the load was distributed, what required inspection, and what didn't. And what I was seeing didn't match any approved process. No permits filed, no inspections done. Wiring that didn't follow code. It wasn't just about legality, it was about safety. Improper connections, overloaded circuits, the kind of issues that don't announce themselves until something fails. And when they fail, they don't give warnings. At that point, it stopped being personal. It stopped being about how I felt in the house. This was something else entirely. Something measurable, provable, and documented. The kind of situation I understood completely. Because, unlike emotions, this followed rules. And rules, when broken consistently, don't just create problems. They create consequences. Once I understood what I was looking at, I stopped reacting and started preparing. Emotion doesn't win anything in situations like this. Evidence does. So I treated it the same way I would treat a structural failure on a job site. Slow, methodical, and precise. I began documenting everything. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would notice. Just quietly, consistently. When Lily spoke to me in that tone she thought no one else heard, I recorded it. When I saw changes to the house that didn't follow code, I took photos, angles, wiring, fixtures, anything that showed exactly what had been altered. Dates, times, details, all logged the way I had done for decades in engineering reports. I didn't confront anything anymore. There was no point. Confrontation without proof only leads to denial, and denial, I already had enough of it. Instead, I let things continue exactly as they were, while I built something underneath the surface. Something they couldn't dismiss or explain away. Every late bill, every unauthorized modification, every conversation that crossed a line, it all became part of a pattern. And patterns, when documented properly, turn into facts. That's when I went back to the paperwork I had signed years earlier, the deed transfer. I read it again, line by line, not as a father trying to help his son, but as a man reviewing a contract. And there it was. A clause I had included, without thinking I would ever need it. Lifetime residency rights, revocable in cases of documented abuse, or what the law defines as gross ingratitude. At the time, it felt like a safeguard. Now, it looked like a solution. I started researching what that actually meant in legal terms, case precedents, definitions, thresholds. What qualifies as a pattern? What counts as evidence? What holds up in court? I didn't guess. I didn't assume. I made sure I understood exactly how the system worked before I stepped into it. Because once you move forward with something like this, there's no halfway point. By the time I was done, I didn't just have suspicions. I had a file, recordings, photographs, financial inconsistencies, a timeline that showed not just isolated incidents, but a sustained pattern of behavior. It wasn't emotional anymore. It was structured. Built the same way I had built everything else in my life, piece by piece, until it could stand on its own. And when it was finished, I knew something they didn't. This wasn't going to be an argument. It was going to be a case. By the time I walked into the lawyer's office, there was nothing left to question, only decisions to execute. I met with Andrew Collins, a real estate attorney with the kind of calm precision I respected. He didn't rush, didn't speculate. He reviewed everything the way I had built it line by line, detail by detail. The recordings, the photos, the financial inconsistencies, the documentation of unauthorized construction work, all of it laid out in a way that didn't rely on emotion, only facts. When he finally looked up, he didn't ask if I was sure. He simply said, "You have a case." And that was enough. Filing the petition wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation, just paperwork submitted, dates set, a process put into motion that no one in that house could stop anymore. When Lily found out, the reaction was exactly what I expected. Anger first. Loud, sharp, deflecting. Then denial. Then blame. She called it betrayal, said I was trying to destroy their lives over nothing. Ethan tried to talk to me, tried to find some middle ground that no longer existed, but I had already crossed that line. This wasn't about fixing something anymore. It was about finishing it. The courtroom was quiet the day of the hearing. Not tense in the way arguments are tense, but controlled, measured. The kind of environment where only one thing matters, what can be proven. Lily sat across from me, confident at first, her attorney speaking in broad arguments about intent, about family, about how a gift should remain a gift. But confidence fades when it meets structure. When my evidence was presented, piece by piece, the room shifted. The recordings spoke without interruption. The photographs showed what words couldn't deny. The financial records filled in the gaps. Then came the witnesses, people who had no reason to take sides, only to tell the truth about what they had seen. The Thanksgiving dinner. Her words. The atmosphere. Not exaggerated. Not emotional. Just clear. And clarity has a weight to it that arguments don't. The judge listened to everything without reaction, reviewing the timeline, the pattern, and the consistency of behavior. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't long. It didn't need to be. She stated that the evidence demonstrated a sustained pattern of disrespect and conduct that met the legal threshold for gross ingratitude, that the clause in the deed was valid, that my right to revoke the transfer was enforceable. Just like that, it was over. Lily's expression changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not confidence, but realization. The kind that comes too late to change anything. Ethan sat beside her, silent again. The same silence that had followed him through everything, only now it had nowhere to hide. They were given a deadline to vacate, legal, final, documented. I didn't feel victory in that moment. Not the kind people imagine. What I felt was something quieter. Resolution. The end of something that had been stretched far past the point it should have broken. There was no satisfaction in taking anything back, only in knowing that what had been built on disrespect couldn't stand. And in the end, that's all the court did. It didn't choose sides. It didn't judge emotion. It recognized structure and enforced it. In the end, everything unfolded exactly the way patterns usually do. Once the structure fails, it doesn't stop halfway. Ethan and Lily lost the house, and with it, the illusion that things could continue the way they had. I heard later that the pressure didn't stop there. Financial strain, legal consequences, a business that couldn't sustain itself without borrowed stability, it all caught up. Not because I made it happen, but because that's what happens when decisions are built on the wrong foundation. As for me, I didn't try to replace what was lost. I didn't look for something bigger or better. I chose something simpler. A smaller house, quiet, manageable, a place where every corner felt honest again, no tension in the air, no conversations that stopped when I walked into a room, just space and peace. I rebuilt my routine the same way I built everything else in my life, slowly, intentionally, without shortcuts. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to justify my presence in my own home. Do I miss my son? Of course I do. That doesn't disappear. But there's a difference between missing someone and allowing yourself to be diminished by them. And that was the line I finally understood. Because at some point, loyalty without boundaries stops being love and starts becoming permission. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that respect isn't something you can assume will always be there, even in your own family. It has to be maintained, protected, and when necessary, enforced. Money can support people, it can give them opportunities, it can even rebuild parts of their lives, but it cannot teach them how to value what they've been given. And it will never buy back respect once it's been lost. Sometimes, silence isn't weakness, it's preparation, a way of stepping back long enough to see clearly, to understand fully, and to respond in a way that actually matters. So now I'll ask you something. If you were in my position, how long would you have stayed silent before deciding enough was enough?